All right, everybody. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about strengthening the core for overhead athletes. You're going to learn how to perform exercises that connect the core with the shoulders and hips to improve your power and prevent injuries. Hey, everybody. My name is Dr. Paul Kachoa, and I partnered with Better Health, or Better Spaces. It's a health and happiness solution for today's hybrid workplace. So I'm a physical therapist, and I'm owner of PAR5 Physical Therapy here in Randolph, New Jersey. And today's easy and educational workday session is all about the overhead athlete. Anybody that's pressing overhead or throwing overhead, and how do we incorporate the core, because our body is a connected system of systems. So a little bit about me. I received my doctorate from Mercy University in upstate New York, and I have a BS in exercise physiology from Rutgers University. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, an orthopedic clinical specialist, a golf fitness trainer, as well as a certified medical professional. So today, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. And I want to make this session as helpful and informative as possible. So let's get started. Without further ado, I'm going to pull up my slides here. So strengthening the core for overhead athletes. Okay, so because I am a medical professional, I have to put up this slide as a disclaimer, because if you're dealing with something specific, please, the stuff that we're going to be talking about in today's class is going to be aimed at a broad population. There is helpful information here, but if you're dealing with something specific, make sure that you address that and get that fully assessed by a medical professional so that you can have all the associative factors and all the things that are connected to your problem addressed. All right. And if you've been to any of my other classes before, this video should be very familiar. It basically explains that the body functions on this alternating pattern of stability and mobility. If this pattern is disrupted, then pain or injury is usually the result. So we want to make sure that what's supposed to be stable is stable, and what is supposed to be mobile is mobile. In regards to the core, we think about the lumbar spine, the lower back, all right? So that's supposed to be a stable segment. We want to activate the core. And then as that connects into the shoulder, what's in between is the thoracic spine, the T-spine. We want that to be mobile. And then the next part of the puzzle here is the scapula, which is the shoulder blade. And we want that to be stable. And we want that to be controlled and strong. And then the mobile segment comes up into the shoulder. So we want the shoulder to be as mobile and flexible as possible. All right. The other thing that we have to take into consideration is that if we're trying to discuss the ability to play a sport and enjoy sport and be powerful and create speed and strength and all that stuff, we need to have a good base. So the hierarchy of movement here, I call it, is basically it starts with your norm range of motion, your joint mobility. Do you have what we call a normative range of motion and enough joint mobility to express your sport or express your function, right? And then are the soft tissues, the muscles, tendons, ligaments, all that, nerves, are those structures extensible? Can they stretch? Can they shorten, right? So that's flexibility. And then can these structures control contracting and relaxing? So that's strength and stability. Can you coordinate all that? And then finally, then we can express the speed and power and express our full skill in the sport. So we can't have the top tier stuff unless we're working on the bottom tier stuff. Now, a couple sessions ago or a couple weeks ago, we talked about the core. And I'm just going to touch on this a couple slides because we went over this in our previous class. You know, the core is basically the abdominals, the back muscles. It's like a three-dimensional barrel that we want to be as stable as possible. I call it the chassis, so that when the chassis of a car is as stable as possible, the engine can express its power and torque so that the vehicle can go fast. So the same thing happens with the body. You know, if the chassis is the core, then the hip muscles and the shoulder muscles be strong and activate and move as much as possible. All right. So I just got some people in the waiting room coming in. All right. So now we've got a We've got a good crew here. And now, just to kind of review really quick again, here's the core. We've got 4 layers of abdominal muscles. Transverse abdominis is the deepest one, then the internal and external obliques, and the rectus abdominis. And then in the back, we have a couple of structures, the multifidus muscles, all these paraspinal muscles here that run up each side of the spine from segment to segment. See that little blow up over here? But you also have what's connected to the shoulder and the shoulder blade. We have the lat muscle, the latissimus dorsi. That's pretty big. And you can see the trapezius muscle, which is that, it's not labeled, but it's a big triangle muscle that goes out to the shoulder blade. And then the deltoid, which is a muscle of the shoulder. So again, in that stable, mobile, stable diagram that we showed earlier, we want to make sure that that shoulder is as mobile as possible, but the shoulder blade is as stable as possible. And the stability comes from lower trap, serratus anterior is another one, and the lat muscle. The latissimus muscle is one of the big things that bridges our lower back to our arm. And that muscle can influence how much range of motion and flexibility we have overhead, particularly. All right, and then if we dive into the front part of the abdominal area, we have hip flexors. So the hip flexors, one of them is the psoas muscle and the iliacus muscle. They both join into the pelvis and insert into the front part of the leg here, and we call that the iliacus muscle because they come in a common insertion point into the hip, and they basically lift the knee up, that they flex the hip. And that is important, as you'll see later, because that can influence the position of our pelvis and the lower back. So this is what I'm talking about. We have good posture where we have something that's more neutral. And then if the pelvis is tilted forward, we have what we call an anterior pelvic tilt. And if the pelvis is tilted backwards, this is the posterior pelvic tilt. A lot of times this tilting, if it's not neutral, it's like driving your car with a really bad front end alignment. The muscles around the area can go under more strain to compensate for the faulty position and also lose power in your sport or lose the ability to contract and relax effectively. So if we look at something like this pose here I borrowed from yoga, if somebody were to go into this warrior pose where they're reaching up over your head, you could probably see that we have this anterior tilt, and then the back really hyperextends, the lumbar spine hyperextends as the arms go overhead, versus a posterior tilt where the arms aren't so much overhead. And my argument is also both of these pictures aren't full flexion overhead motion. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you could tell the difference between a neutral spine and an unneutral spine, or an extended spine, neutral spine versus an extended spine. Now, straight overhead, we have this picture. If you're just pressing a barbell or pressing a weight overhead, a lot of times we'll see this first thing, that hyperextension of that anterior tilt and the hyperextension of your lower back can create a lot of strain on your lower back. And it also shuts off the abdominals. The abdominals are the muscles in the front. And if they're stretched out, they're lengthened, they have a hard time to pull against that tension. And the muscles in the back, the paraspinal muscles, if they're extended, or if your back is going into extension, they become shorter and they actually have more tension. So you'll feel that a lot more in your spine. And the lumbar spine doesn't tolerate a lot of axial loading or forward or up and down pressure when you're in this position. We like to be in this position better because, again, neutral pelvis and core is engaged, and we can express that overhead flexion in full range of motion. So here's an example of full end range shoulder flexion. Normal range of motion overhead is like about 170, 180 degrees, bicep by the ears. You could see this right here. In the previous picture, you could see, like, even though this arm is pointed up vertical, it's not quite 180, 170 degrees, because as you can see here, when we normalize the pelvic tilt and the spine angle, the arm is a little bit forward. It's probably like 160, 155 degrees there. So we want to have full ability to go overhead. And I see this a lot in my clients that have shoulder problems, is that they lose this ability to go overhead. All right, so let's talk about a couple exercises, core strengthening exercises, hip and shoulder mobility, and how it all ties into everything that we talked about. All right, so let me just pull up my other camera here. All right, so here I am here. So the first thing, I've done a bunch of other classes for better health or better spaces. Said it again. And basically, I've spoken about the core and what we call the two-handed rule. The two-handed rule is this: we imagine, and this is pioneered by this physical therapist called Kelly Starrett. He wrote this book called Desk Bound. Anyway, if I have a hand at my sternum and a hand at my pubis or belly button, these are the two hands. I don't want those muscles or those points of contact to change or to become shorter or become farther apart. So if I look at my spine, I'm standing, and I squeeze my glute as hard as possible, that creates that neutral pelvis, right? So this is, I'm going to try and do it here. It hurts my back. It's hyperextension, right? That anterior tilt. And then the posterior tilt, right? So that's that picture that I showed earlier. Now, if I apply the two-handed rule to this, I have one hand here at my sternum and then one hand on my pubic bone. If I kind of contract my glutes, stabilize my pelvis, and then kind of figure out where is my norm, where's my center, I want to maintain that as I'm doing something else with my hands and or legs or whatever, or throwing a ball or lifting weights. So I never want the hands to come together where I come into this flexion position or totally come apart. All right, especially when we're talking about loaded things. All right, there are instances where, if we're talking about high-speed movements, that we get into this position to create a stretch reflex. A stretch reflex is basically like a rubber band. If I pull apart the rubber band, I create that stretch, and momentarily, it's able to create in that muscle a higher velocity when it contracts. All right, so those are the things that we want to think about and keep in mind, that core two-handed rule. So the other thing we want to talk about here is just shoulder flexion, right? Shoulder flexion would be, again, overhead and kind of bicep to ear without having this part hyperextend, right? So we don't want to have this part come apart as I'm going overhead. Now, certainly, if I'm going to throw a ball, or if I am an athlete that requires me to throw something overhead, that movement doesn't start at the shoulder. I can generate a lot more force if I use my legs and I use the ground, right? So this ground reaction force, as Newton's laws of physics is that we're pushing against the ground and the ground pushes against us to create force, is that if I push and I kind of get into this position as I'm stepping forward to throw something, I kind of create this movement and rotation through my lower half. My pelvis rotates, and then my torso is connected to my hips via the abdominals. And then this hand and arm are cocked into this position to create that stretch reflex. And I want to be able to kind of crunch this down and drive my pelvis, and then finally throw and extend and into my arm. So anytime I'm going overhead, throwing high velocity, the body can only move as fast as it has the ability to slow down. So you think about like a high-speed car, a Corvette or a Ferrari, the engine that's in there and the speed that that car has ability to go to is limited by how good it can stop. So the brakes, right? So our body consciously knows that I can throw this maybe 100 miles an hour, but if I don't have the strength of the muscles that slow my arm down, I'm not going to be able to express that ability to go 100% all out. All right. So a couple exercises to work on mobility of the shoulder. And this is kind of like a review of some of the things that we've talked about in other classes about shoulder stuff. Is, for overhead range of motion, we want flexibility through this lat, but more importantly, we want to be able to have this this collarbone here rotate up and back as it's connected to the shoulder blade as your arm goes overhead, okay? And what's in here typically is like the ribs and the upper trapezius muscle, the first rib that's up top here, that can inhibit that last couple degrees that we need. So we're going to take a ball. Lacrosse ball works well, or you can use a tennis ball or a baseball. But I like the lacrosse ball because of its tacky surface. We put that right under here. So I'm going to show you in a minute here that it goes underneath that upper trap, and the target is our first or second rib right here. And then I'm going to lie down. So once I get on the floor, all right, so you can see me in the camera here, good. And you put that underneath that spot there, and then you mobilize with movement. So we're going to take that arm, lead with the thumb into external rotation. That creates more space in the shoulder joint, so we have less chance of impinging or pinching rotator cuff tendons as we go overhead. And then we repeatedly do this. So mobilization with movement as I'm going overhead. I'm just going to repeat this for about 1.5 to 2 minutes and trying to scour out angles or positions where I feel restricted. I want to be able to relax that muscle that's underneath the ball, or the ball's underneath that muscle, and not tense up as I go into this position. The other thing I want to keep in mind is that this is all about the core and our chassis. As I come up, I don't want my lower back to arch, and I want to try and prevent my ribs from popping up off the ground or extending or violating that two-handed rule as I'm doing this as well. All right, so I'm going to do this for a minute, 1.5 to 2 minutes, just kind of scouring and moving into that direction, trying to keep my core organized. All right, so that's one way to do that. Another one is a vertical force with a PVC pipe and a little ball that I put at the end. So this is just for comfort. So we have that first move that we just did with the ball pressing from back to front on that first rib region. And then this one is going to be pressing down on that first rib region. So what I do is I put this right up against the wall. Okay. And then that ball will go right up top here and press down. And I'm going to apply that pressure with my body position. So also lying down, I'm going to find my spot, okay, close to my neck. Target is going to be our first rib, and we're going to create a downward force. And the more I push my pelvis or push my body up, the more pressure I have, okay? And then once I maintain that position and have that pressure and be comfortable and breathe, I'm going to still do my two-handed rule, keep my ribs down, and repeat our overhead motion, mobilization with movement. Same thing, try to push into that. Everything stays the same pretty much that we just did with the other ball, but now we're working at a different line of force, which is pushing down. All right, so again, 1.5 to 2 minutes. If we do that every day, you should feel like we can have more range of motion overhead. All right. And then we talk about the abdominals, all right? So in the previous classes, we talked about the hollow hold progression, basically trying to be cognizant about what this position is like. Real simple, we'll go through this really quick, is, cat-camel movements, right? So you can see me in the camera here, where I'm hyperextending the spine and then rounding it out. And I want this motion, there's a little dirt right here. I want this motion to happen at my pelvis and my lower back. I don't want to have like shoulder and head movement. I want this motion, and I'm activating my lower back when I go into this, like I'm tightening my lower back muscles, and I'm tightening my abdominal muscles to get that other pelvic tilt direction, right? So once I'm comfortable with that, we're going to flip over onto your back, and both legs straight, toes are pointed, knees straight, and then my arms are going to go overhead. In this position here, this should create space between my lower back and the floor, right? So I'm basically taking my spine, extending everything, and putting my spine and my pelvis in that anterior tilt and taking my spine off the ground. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use those same muscles that we use for abdominals, curls, and all that stuff, and I'm going to push my lower back into the floor. I'm going to make that as flat as possible. I can relax. So I want to feel like I could use my abdominals to flatten out. Hopefully you could see that movement there. As I relax, it kind of pops up, and then I'm pushing down. If that's hard, we can repeat this with the knees bent, feet together. I can do the same thing, kind of pushing down and then relax, and then pushing down and then relax. And then if we need more, I guess, intensity of this exercise, we can go into pushing down first, flattening, coming up, raising my arms and shoulder blades off the floor, activating this even more strongly, and then coming back and then relaxing the abdominals. So I can do that a couple of times, and I've done this series for the abdominals on the floor in a lot of other different classes. So you can kind of look that up in the Better Spaces apps. But another thing that we do to kind of translate this into the overhead and overhead athletes is to how do we apply what we did on the floor into a more upright position. So one of the other things is this hip flexor stretch. We're getting into this half, no, let's go this way, half kneeling position, right? So you can kind of see me in the camera there, where I can kind of organize my pelvis into that anterior tilt and that posterior tilt. All right, so I have this posterior tilt, keeping that two-handed rule, abdominals on, and I can work on trying to move my arm overhead. And this is my left hand here, so I'm going to try and do this where I'm trying to throw and kind of go through a throwing motion while I'm doing this. And I'm trying to organize and activate my core. So that's the motion. Then we could add some strengthening stuff to this. All right, so we talked about slowing down and using the rotator cuff muscles. You can only move as fast as the rotator cuff muscles can slow you down. So there's a lot of bigger muscles that help propel the arm forward when we're throwing or moving things overhead. And the rotator cuff muscles are the smaller ones that help to keep the shoulder blade in the socket. And the trapezius muscle and the other muscles in the back also help to slow it down. So I've got this simple band here. I could kind of apply the same things that we just talked about here, trying to find that pelvic neutral, right? Abdominals on, two-handed rule applied, and I could work into this rotator cuff external rotation position here, where I'm working on using, I have to stabilize my glute, my core, and then the rotator cuff and trapezius muscles as I'm going through here. And I can do this by holding it, or I could attach this to a stable surface and then kind of do that on my own, like this. So again, I can do this on the right side. Hopefully you can kind of see this. I contract my core, pelvis neutral, two-hand rule, elbow up at 90 degrees, and I go out like this. So I can go fast, I can go slow with this, especially if we're talking about dynamic movements like throwing. We want to be able to kind of do this quickly. And then also if we're talking about overhead pressing, we can do the same thing. If I have like a weighted here, you can imagine if I press overhead, I could do the same thing with this, trying to maintain that good stability here, because this position right here challenges my pelvic position and my core as I press overhead. And I want to make sure that I press overhead and then get my bicep to my ear. I don't want to be pressing out like this. All right, so we saw that in the picture earlier, that this position isn't vertical, that position is vertical. All right, and then we talked about the same things in a lunge position. Right, if I'm here, I could stay with the band and then work on doing the same things instead of that half kneeling position, get into like a throwing position here and then kind of doing the same thing where I'm working on going quickly into this position here as I'm coming up and back. As I'm going up and back, I want to maintain some good core stability so I don't have my spine come up as my arm goes up. And then we can talk about plyometrics and some power off press and stuff, variations. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can get into. I think we're running a little bit out of time here. We only got a couple more minutes. But another one that I like is the power off press variations. It's basically with a band that's attached 90 degrees to your body. And then we can get into like that lunge position. Actually, let's just do it this way. This is attached 90 degrees. And I can kind of take my arm and then kind of work like this and then challenge the core as this is an anti-rotation exercise. And if I want to go overhead with this, I can kind of do the same thing here. So core is engaged, pelvis is tucked, arm goes overhead, and I'm maintaining that core stability as I create that arm motion. All right, so I think that's all that I have lined up for. Hopefully you guys found that informative. Let me check the chat. If there is any questions, feel free to use the chat box here. Get all your questions answered. I'm going to give it a 30-second countdown, and then I'm going to sign off and have everybody enjoy their Tuesday afternoon. All righty. So let's see. Anything else? We're good? All righty. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining me today. You could look for this session and many more on demand on any of the Better Spaces apps. I have a whole bunch of classes previously on the core, strengthening of the shoulder, mobility of shoulder, all that stuff. You can look that up into there. I'll be back on Tuesday, March 4th, my next class. It's going to be CrossFit, balancing intensity and injury prevention. So we'll explore the benefits and risks associated with CrossFit training, emphasizing the importance of proper form, scaling exercises, and recovery strategies to prevent overuse injuries. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me here at paul@par5pt.com or team@betterspaces.com. All right. Thanks for coming and be well. You're welcome.